Hey there, adventurers, and welcome back to another episode of the Awkward Dungeon Master. This week, we're going to talk about poisons, madness, and disease. Get ready. So, first off, a more simple topic. Poisons. There are only a handful of ways that you can come into contact with poisons. There's only a few ways that they function, I should say, rather. So, there is contact, inhalation, injury, and the last one is inhaled. So typically with contact and injury poisons, you're going to encounter those in dungeons, typically on weapons. So fairly self-explanatory. For most poisons, there is some kind of a DC save depending on what the poison does, whether it paralyzes you or gives you the poison condition or does damage. It just kind of depends. There's all sorts out there. There's an entire page of it in the DMG. All of this stuff is on pages 256 to 259 if you are interested in looking it up. There's some really interesting and useful material in there, so DMG is always a great tool. So next up we have inhaled poisons. So anytime you're inhaling a poison, it's most likely part of a trap. You can use them as like a powder and blow them into people's faces, but personally for me as a dungeon master, it doesn't make sense for you to not get hit also. So unless the individual that is using that powder and blowing it into somebody's face is immune to poison, that makes no sense. So typically, that's going to be part of a trap. And again, always saves associated with traps. And the last one is ingested. So this one's more intriguing. Or I guess you're going to be using it in a more intriguing way. It's going to be you trying to poison someone's drink or slip it in somehow into food. Alright, I imagine you could use it in torture too, but hopefully there aren't a ton of people out there that regularly torture NPCs or other important members of their D&D party. I would hope. Let's just not and say we did. But with ingested poisons, you could also ascribe some sort of perception check for, watching them put the poison into a drink. So if you were trying to save someone's life or something like that, or if there's some kind of weird smell or quality to the food that you're eating. So, poisons. Pretty straightforward, right? No problems there. The next one I want to talk to you guys about is diseases. Diseases, there's not a whole lot of information about in the Dungeon Master's Guide, but they can be really interesting. And in past editions, there have been all different kinds of diseases, so if you're not stuck with 5th edition, or if you can modify rules or create your own mechanics for those things, there can be some really cool uses of them, like plagues and getting into stuff down in dungeons and then bringing it back to the surface. So diseases can be a lot of fun. And along with diseases, I really want to talk about lycanthropy, even though it is technically a curse. I've run into this as a player before, and there were some kind of technical issues with it. Granted, we were playing 3.5 at the time, but honestly, for diseases, madness, lycanthropy, those kinds of things seem to have mostly narrative qualities to them. If you're not running a super narrative game, for me, a lot of the effect of those things is lost. So perhaps take that into account when you're deciding whether or not to use them. I think that if you are not willing to add a lot of narration and a lot of story elements into those things, if you're going to have them in your game, they lose their quality for me. But lycanthropy. So when I encountered this in a game, I had gotten infected with lycanthropy, and the people I was playing with had metagamed. They're like, "Oh shit, you're gonna be a werewolf," and I'm like, "Fuck me, what does that mean?" Nobody would tell me what was going on as a player, so I really felt like I was on the outs as far as what was going to happen to me. What eventually did happen was my character was taken out of my control, and I murdered a bunch of people. There were no indications on me whatsoever that I had done anything like that. So I was very, very confused as to what was going on or how I was supposed to in-game realize that I had turned into a were-rat, technically, but, still in that family of 80 million lycanthropes that are out there. But I just wasn't sure as a player, how I was supposed to go about fixing that. And there just wasn't a whole lot of indication to my character what was going on. And as a player, I didn't know how to go about curing that. So I was looking through the monster manual, because there's not actually any information about lycanthropy in the DMG. And the lycanthrope stuff in the monster manual is on page 206, if you're interested in reading some of the stuff about them. But basically what it said was, if your character is fighting the lycanthropy, is not a willing participant in that curse, you're not willing to give yourself over to it, then you may be unaware of what you're doing whenever the next full moon comes around and you change for the first time. You may be completely off the rails. But it did also put in there a way that you can kind of give your players' characters some ways of figuring out, deducing that that's what's happening to them. It specifically describes a character who is unaware that they are a lycanthrope and is turning into a werewolf or a were-rat at night and ravaging the town and such things. Everything that they do can be perceived to them as some kind of nightmarish, bloody dream. So you can relate that to them in those terms. So when they get taken over by the lycanthropy, you can describe to them what happens in a dreamlike state to kind of give some more gravity, context, importance to the situation, so it doesn't just feel like, oh, well, this is happening to my character and there's nothing I can do about it and I'm fucked. So I think that's really important. It's important to give your players a way to work around things like that in a way that makes sense for the mechanics of the game and the story that you're trying to tell. So a lot of these things add a ton to the stories. You really, really need to keep in mind where you want your stories to go if you're going to add them in. So the last thing we're going to talk today about is madness. There are 3 different kind of levels of madness. You have short-term madness, long-term madness, and indefinite madness. So with the short-term madness, a lot of that is very, very temporary effects. So normal kind of combat-related things, like you're paralyzed or confused or something along those lines. Very limited madness, very limited repercussions for the things that are happening in the moment, typically during a combat or something like that. So short-term madness, pretty straightforward. Not all that exciting. But then we go to long-term madness, which can last for a few weeks or a couple months in game, but it's really easy to get rid of. So if you wanted to modify some of these rules, if you wanted something that was more impactful, I guess I should say, I would do that, because the long-term madness, just for me, doesn't really impact the game all that much. It can be cured with lesser restoration, and bada bing, bada boom, you're fine. There's that. But some of the effects are slightly more interesting. So if we go to page 260, character loses the ability to speak. Yeah, that's inconvenient for however long that lasts. My apologies. This says 1d10 times 10 hours. So not a few weeks, just a few days. I wouldn't consider that long term, but okay. The character regards something, usually the source of madness, with intense revulsion, as if affected by the antipathy effect of the antipathy-sympathy spell. Whatever. Okay. Character becomes attached to a lucky charm, such as a person or an object, and has disadvantage on attack rolls, ability checks, and saving throws while more than 30 feet away from it. So it's just kind of, weird stuff like that. And there is one in here that specifically gives them the effects of the confusion spell, which is a duration of 1 minute. So that's a little bit more intense. Oh, anytime they take damage, they're affected by the confusion spell. So, super fun! Basically a sleeping curse. So, there's some slightly more interesting things on here, but they're easily cured. So for me, it kind of loses some of its charm. But then we go on to indefinite madness, which again can be cured, according to the book. But I do believe that there are some cases in storytelling and things that you're doing where maybe they shouldn't be cured. Kind of like when you're playing games like Pandemic Legacy, where your characters have to take scars that permanently affect the character that you're playing in that game. I feel like if you have a party that's open to those kinds of story developments, you should take advantage of it, because I think that makes characters more interesting. Possibly an unpopular opinion, but what do I know? I just like to keep things interesting. On the indefinite madness table, just to throw a couple of things out there for you, it's mostly, they're flaws. So easy enough, so there's just some flaws on here that your character permanently has. Again, this requires some commitment from your players and some role play participation on their part. So if you don't have players that are super into story development, character development, and role play, all of these things lose their charm. But I digress. Here are a few examples. I keep whatever I find. I must bend the truth, exaggerate, or outright lie to be interesting to other people, okay? I am convinced that powerful enemies are hunting me and their agents are everywhere I go. I am sure they're watching me all of the time. Alright, that's fine. You want to be a paranoid son of a bitch? That works. 96 to 100 is pretty good since these are all on D100 tables. I've discovered that I really like killing people. I believe they call that a murder hobo, and there's one in almost every party already. So, you definitely don't have to stick to the tables that are provided for you. Always feel free to expand on these kinds of things. These are just examples / suggestions, but obviously, if you have better ideas, throw them in there. / also maybe throw them down in the comments below, because I like seeing that kind of stuff. It's fun. So much fun things. Oh my goodness. I'm trying to think of a time. I know I've done the long-term madness before after a dungeon in one of my games. I'm trying to remember what effect they had. I think it was the delusions. Extreme paranoia. It was something along that line. It was more of a paranoid type thing, but the player that I had that had wound up with the long-term madness wasn't super into roleplay, and somebody cured them not even 20 minutes later in game, so it never really came into play hugely, and they didn't roleplay it very heavily. I don't know. If you guys have ever had some instances where someone in your party did something really cool because of poison, disease, madness, lycanthropy, I would really love to hear those stories, so if you want to throw them in the comments down below or hit me up on social media, that would be fucking amazing. And until next time, keep it rolling, adventurers.